Welcome to Auto Ricambi's FIAT 124 Spider lower ball joint replacement video. First of all, let's make sure we have all the pieces that we need. We have the ball joint with the nut, and then we have the hardware. Should be 3 bolts, 3 nuts, 3 washers. This is just a protective plastic piece on the ball joint. We can just remove that before installation. Next, we have to undo the 22mm nut that holds the ball joint to the spindle, and there is just barely enough room to put a 22mm wrench on there. However, we need to have somebody hold the steering, because if we try and just undo it, it will simply turn the steering. If this nut gets rounded off and we cannot get it with an open end wrench, unfortunately there's just not enough room there to put a box end of the wrench on it. So there are a couple of other solutions we can do. We can try using a chisel and a hammer to turn it by putting it on one of the flats. The other solution is to take off the brake disc, and once we do that, we can take off the steering arm, and if we take off the steering arm, there's gonna be more room to put a socket or an open end wrench on this nut. It's rare, usually we can get it with an open end, but if it's not, then there are other solutions. I unscrewed the ball joint nut as far as it will go, but before it comes off, it ends up hitting the steering arm right there, so we cannot take it off just yet. But that's not a bad thing, because it will be putting pressure on the steering arm, pushing the ball joint down, and our next objective is to separate the ball joint from the spindle. There are 2 ways to do that. One popular way is to use a pickle fork, and one just hammers it basically between the spindle and the ball joint until the two separate. The other method is to use a big hammer and hit the spindle right there with great force, and that deforms the spindle in a split second, and that makes the ball joint pop out, and this nut putting some pressure on it downward helps doing that. Here's a loose spindle, and it's easier to show on this how to separate the ball joint from the spindle. The 2 methods are either to use a pickle fork, and we just put it between the ball joint and the spindle, and then one uses a largish hammer to hammer it in, and as it gets hammered in, it will force the ball joint out. But the other method is to hit the spindle right there where the ball joint goes through it, right there with great force with a larger hammer, and very often that will pop it right out. Not on the first try, but after a few tries of hitting it with great force, it pops the ball joint out. After repeatedly hitting the spindle there, and you can see I mistimed hitting the arm one time, but after I repeatedly hit the spindle, we are able to break it loose, and it is indeed loose. So now we are able to undo this nut. And once the nut is removed, we can go ahead and remove the 3 nuts and bolts that secure the ball joint to the A-arm. Once all the bolts are loose, we can remove the ball joint. Observe how it goes in from the bottom. It does not sit on top. This is the correct way to install it. This next step is very important. We have to make sure that the A-arm control arm is in good condition and doesn't have any cracks. Inspect it for cracks anywhere near where the ball joint mounts, especially in this area right there, or anywhere around any of the bolt holes, even up here. They can crack, it's not common, but we've seen them, and of course if it's cracked, that means that A-arm needs to be replaced. As they say, installation is the reverse of removal. So we Put the ball joint up there, thread the nut on loosely. Now that we have tightened the ball joint nuts, we can go ahead and tighten the big nut, 22 millimeter. And sometimes we have a situation as we turn this nut, the actual stud of the ball joint starts turning. What we can do to keep that from happening is jack up the A-arm so that the ball joint gets pushed in the spindle, and that will stop the spinning. I even seen people who put like straps around the two arms to cinch them together and push this down into the ball joint, and that will keep the stud from turning. So we are finishing tightening the nut. We can only get the open end in there, so just give it pretty much all we can give it. With new ball joints installed, we can drive with confidence.